How's it going, everybody? Today I'm here to do a special review for all of you, leading up to Supergirl, which will be released at the end of next month. Starting off with Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, directed by Zack Snyder, written by Chris Terrio and David S. Goyer, starring everybody. Henry Cavill, Ben Affleck, Gal Gadot, Jesse Eisenberg, Diane Lane, and most of, not all, the returning cast members from Man of Steel. This was a huge inflection point in the DCEU, and one that was the start of the eventual downfall. The Justice League really sent it further down the tubes, but this was basically the start of the dominoes falling. And to be honest, the foundation wasn't really that strong to begin with, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. But if you haven't seen Dawn of Justice by now, it's been over 10 years. You've had plenty of time, but I will be going into spoilers, so if you don't want to know anything, get away. And one big disclaimer that I want to get out of the way is that I'm talking about the theatrical cut, not the Ultimate Edition. I'll mention maybe one or two things of the Ultimate Edition that I've heard about. Maybe I'll check it out one day, but right now, my desire isn't there. The plot of this movie is basically what the title says, set a year and a half after the events of Man of Steel, where Batman is determined to go up against Superman, thinking that he's an evil monster that needs to be wiped out, along with the rest of the world questioning whether or not Superman should actually exist. And corporate billionaire Lex Luthor, played by Jesse Eisenberg, has a plan to throw a wrench into everything. Sounds like a lot that's going on, doesn't it? As the movie goes on, yeah, it becomes explicitly clear. If you had seen my Man of Steel review from last year, I did not care for it personally. It still remains my Phantom Menace, where I was in denial about how let down I was. Then when I watched it again last year, it was still a letdown, but not nearly as bad as I remembered. And I could say the same thing in this situation. Back when I saw this in 2016, I was not kind to this at all. I would go as far as to say that I hated it. Watching it the other night was my first time in over 10 years seeing it, so I was kind of nervous and curious to see how I was going to respond to this, especially after we saw how everything went down with the DCEU after the Justice League situation, and also with the clean slate that we're in with this current DC universe under James Gunn. I'll be honest, I actually don't hate it as much as I did back then. My thoughts have actually kind of settled somewhat. I was able to have a somewhat better understanding of what was happening with the plot. We'll talk about that as we go on. Still not good though. Still not an endorsement. After everything that happened with Man of Steel, as far as the box office and critical response and the fan response as well, it was pretty polarizing, even though it made a good amount of money, which was more than enough for Warner Brothers to give it the green light for a sequel. So they had a chance to repair some of the damage that was done in the eyes of the detractors. So not only did they announce a sequel to Man of Steel, they were going to include a new interpretation of Batman, where they would be going up against each other and how it would eventually lead to the formation of the Justice League, the equivalent of the Avengers in the DC universe. I still remember in 2013 hearing the Comic-Con announcements about it, just how stunned and unsure I was. If you thought that Amazing Spider-Man 1 was way too soon of a reboot for Spider-Man, 5 years after Spider-Man 3, this window is even shorter in comparison. Dark Knight Rises had just wrapped up the Dark Knight trilogy in 2012, and originally this movie was going to come out in 2015, 3 years after. Then they moved it to 2016, which was about 3.5 or 4-ish years. Still a relatively close window in my estimation. My thoughts on Man of Steel aside, at the time I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, and they eventually announced Ben Affleck, which was a huge controversy with the comic book fans. Certainly not the first time that's happened. Michael Keaton got a fair share of that back in the day, Heath Ledger when he was cast as the Joker. The list is endless, really, but after a while, I was able to warm up to the idea of Ben Affleck, but a big hang-up for a lot of people back then was the fact that he was in Daredevil. Look guys, it wasn't exactly a good movie, but it really wasn't that bad either. And if anything, it showed that he could play a brooding type of character. He has the look in his eyes where he's able to convey to the audience that deep down underneath all that male bravado, he's deeply damaged. The anticipation around this movie was pretty big. The fact that Superman and Batman would be sharing the same screen together for the first time in cinema history, even for me, someone back then who wasn't really a reader of comics, and I'm still kind of not, even though I am trying to rectify that, this was a pretty big deal. And it was something that fans had been dreaming about for a long time. Of course, we saw them team up in comics, but we saw them team up in the animated side of things. I think it was called The World's Finest. I could be wrong about that. It was the Batman animated series crossing over with the Superman animated series. So naturally, the next step eventually would be in live action. Then the trailers came out and the anticipation got bigger and bigger. And eventually when it was released, the critical response to it was quite bad. In fact, currently on the tomato meter, it's 28% positive from the critics. However, the audience members seem to like it, although the score isn't really that high as it should be, I guess, with the way everybody hypes this up so much. Yeah, let's not go there. There was a lot of bold swings that this movie took, and for myself, I don't know if it was admirable, but even now, watching it 10 years later, it still doesn't really work for me. A lot of the choices, including the Martha scene. More on that later. I also want to clarify something else. I'm not a hater of Zack Snyder. I don't think he's a horrible filmmaker, as I've heard some people say. I even heard someone that I used to follow say that Zack Snyder has the mind of a child. I think that's a little extreme, but whatever. But clearly this guy's really passionate about the source material, and I've heard him say in some interviews just how into it he was and that he wanted to make something unique for the audience. And while I do respect him for that, I think often he gets really lost in all the style and doesn't really focus so much on the substance. This is something that I've heard people say about his filmography. I haven't seen all of his other movies. From the clips I've seen of the movie 300, it's pretty clear, and I could tell. And whether you like it or not, his movies do exude a sense of authorship, similar to the likes of Tim Burton, Chris Nolan, M. Night Shyamalan, Sam Raimi, etc. If you're a fan of his style, well, this movie's more than likely going to be for you. His style's not really for me, but there is some sort of respect that I do have for him, admittedly. And I could see him making a comic book adaptation that is very much inspired by the graphic novel side of things. In fact, I think he should make a Punisher movie, or a Punisher TV show, whether or not it is John Bernthal as the Punisher. Enough of the sidebars though, let's get into the movie. The film opens up with a flashback to Bruce's childhood, where we see the death of his parents and the inevitable funeral and how he eventually gets the idea of becoming the Batman. I admittedly find it kind of neat to see how a storyteller is able to show a certain famous event from the Batman lore through their own lenses. This one is very sleek and stylized, and it's clearly Zack Snyder doing his thing. One nitpick I have, when Joe Chill puts the gun in Martha Wayne's face and she falls to the ground, there is no bullet hole in her face at all. People say that Marvel movies are for babies and DC is for grown-ass adults. Realistically speaking, not to be too graphic, that should be a lot more gruesome than it turned out to be. Then we fast forward to the present, where Bruce is in Metropolis telling his employees to get out of the building, while Superman and Zod are going at each other, crashing through all these buildings. This is probably the best scene in the movie, because we see Bruce Wayne running towards a collapsing building, which some people have pointed out is very similar to the events of 9/11 when the World Trade Center collapsed. And just in those small moments, I think they actually respected the character of Bruce Wayne. Underneath that whole brooding facade, he really is a brave person. And it's the only character motivation that I understand in this whole movie, because from his perspective, for all he knows, Superman and Zod had a disagreement and they were recklessly causing destruction in Metropolis, which led to a lot of people getting killed. But then it cuts to 18 months later, where Superman is more than established by now, and a lot of people around the world are questioning whether or not he can be trusted. Not as far as Bruce Wayne is concerned, and he's coming up with a tactic to bring Superman down. With a certain Senate committee led by the senator from Kentucky, played by Holly Hunter, I would say the first third of this movie is actually not that bad. With the way the film opens on Metropolis, seeing it from Bruce's perspective, it does, I think, a good enough job of conveying just how determined Bruce is to stop Superman. Because like I said, from his perspective, Superman is practically a monster. And we see Clark Kent going about his everyday life, working for the Daily Planet, dating Lois Lane. And then we also have Lex Luthor coming up with his own shenanigans from LexCorp and what he's trying to do to stop Superman. By the time the halfway point comes in, the movie really starts to fall apart at the seams for me, because there's so much that they try to jam-pack in here, from the two converging storylines between Batman and Superman, the inclusion of Wonder Woman, and all the hints of the Justice League. By the time the third act comes in, it is a huge, gigantic clusterfuck. So the plot of this movie is basically the rivalry between Superman and Batman and how they will eventually go up against each other and then they become allies later on. I've heard some people say that they don't like the idea of superheroes fighting each other, and they had a similar criticism with Captain America Civil War, which came out in the same year as this one. But when you have big personalities like this, inevitably there's going to be some disputes or disagreements. I've heard this is a thing in other portrayals, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the different ideologies and tactics that make Superman and Batman clash with each other. Both are heroic figures, but they have different methods in order to achieve those means. But this is where it gets complicated for me, because while I do understand Batman's reasons for hating Superman, Superman hating Batman is something that I don't understand at all. I'm not making this up, and again, I'm talking about the theatrical cut, but Superman never says once as to why he's so interested in Batman. At one point during that Batmobile sequence, which I think is around the halfway point, and admittedly, while that moment is really awesome where Batman stands up in the Batmobile and they're staring each other down, Superman says this:
"Next time they shine your light in the sky, don't go to it. The bat is dead. Bury it."
Why? Why does he hate Batman so much? What did he do to him? And it's not just Superman. The other character motivations are not clear either. Lex Luthor isn't exactly clear, and other characters like Lois Lane or Diana Prince, Wonder Woman, they're just kind of there. And I literally just turned on my fan because it was getting hot in here. That's where I think this movie starts to snowball for me. The lack of context with Superman's disdain towards Batman is a big indicator of where this is going. Because most of their interactions up until the Martha scene, it's all of them just taunting each other and flexing their muscles at one another. Which I guess you involve two guys with a lot of testosterone. That's bound to happen one way or another, but you would think as far as the dialogue's concerned, we'd actually hear some smart exchanges between the two. I do like that moment, though, where Bruce is able to push back on Clark's questions, calling out the hypocrisy on the Daily Planet praising Superman yet criticizing Batman's methods, because in reality, they're both vigilantes working outside the law. But let's talk about Batman. A lot of people consider Ben Affleck to be the best portrayal of the character. I call this the Andrew Garfield syndrome. When people talk about the Amazing Spider-Man movies, they say that Andrew Garfield is the best part of that series and that he's actually a great Spider-Man. He's fine, but there's a lot of problems I have with what they do with him here. I mean, for starters, the fact that he kills people, which is what everybody has talked about in the last 10 years, and that it's all part of some sort of arc where he becomes more of the Batman that we all know and love. There's really no context as to why he kills people. You could say that him looking at the Robin costume that he has in his Batcave is an indicator for that, which based on the writing of that costume, I think we can all assume that it's Jason Todd, who is famously killed by the Joker in the Batman comics. But that on my end is a really vague hint to all that. And I know some of you will probably say show don't tell. Yes, I agree with that, but sometimes telling along with showing can really go a long way. He could have had at least one moment where Alfred calls Bruce out on this, and Bruce would respond with, "They killed Robin and I have nothing left to live for." If there was a reason for Batman killing people, and if that was the reason, I would have been fine with it. And besides the lifeless colors that they have in here, which I know for some people is a big problem, the stuff that's going on in here is mostly focused on the plot and not so much on the characters. There are some character moments that we do get, yes. It's all about getting from point A to point B, about how to stop Lex Luthor, how to stop Superman, and we don't really get much scenes of certain characters just talking about what they're feeling. The worst offender out of all this is what they do with Superman. I had some issues with Superman and Man of Steel. This exacerbates it even further. Superman in this movie has a major, and I mean major, communication problem. He's solely focused on what Batman is doing, and we don't really see some kind of agency for him to explain to the world what exactly happened during the events of Man of Steel. He's always worried about how the world perceives him. He goes to the mountain to pout to some vision of his father, Jonathan Kent, and he has a couple of moments with his adoptive mother, Martha, and with Lois Lane. But even then, we don't really hear from him about what he's feeling. The one opportunity they could have had to clear all that stuff up is when he goes to the US Capitol building in front of that Senate committee. And just before Superman could open his mouth and say something, the whole building goes up. Thanks to that guy in the wheelchair that worked for Bruce Wayne and his legs were crushed in the collapse of that building, which I didn't remember that was actually Scoot McNairy, who I guess is now another BFF for Ben Affleck besides Matt Damon, since he's collaborated with him not only in this film, but Argo and Gone Girl. In fact, I was going to save this for later, but, I had a visceral reaction when that building blew up, and all we see is Superman just standing there looking depressed.
Look at it. Just stands there.
Not even showing any kind of urgency to look for survivors. He's just standing there looking so sad. Now, I heard in the Ultimate Cut the firefighters are saying, no, there's nothing you can do, just let us do our work. If that's the case, then alright, fine, I can let that go. But if he's still standing there, moping around like that, I'm sorry, but that's insult to injury as far as I'm concerned. We're not put into Superman's headspace. He's way too cut off and sad. And it shows in certain scenes where he's helping people, like in that Day of the Dead parade, or when that flood happens. He doesn't really look that excited to help anybody. And this is all during a montage where we see news footage of people talking about Superman's presence and whether or not he actually is a hero. But even in that montage, I can see the potential there as to what they could have done to explore with the Superman character. But none of that stuff goes anywhere. Because like I said, Superman doesn't really talk to anybody. Never saying to anybody about what he's feeling in any of these movies that we've seen him in. And this is not a knock against Henry Cavill, but I'm not a fan of Superman in this series. I also heard there was something that happened in the Ultimate Cut about that explosion with Jenna Malone's character, whose role was ultimately cut out of this. Ultimately. I apologize for the pun, but she's some sort of forensic analysis, I suppose, and she along with Lois Lane are able to figure out how the guy in the wheelchair snuck into the building without the bomb detector going off. And they figure out, oh, that's why he couldn't see it, because it was encased in lead. When have we established that Superman can't see through lead in this universe? Segueing into Lex Luthor, played by Jesse Eisenberg. I hated this casting choice back then. I'm still not a fan of it now, but it's not nearly as obnoxious as I remembered, although some of those little quirks that he throws in there where he goes, that feels more like Jim Carrey's Riddler in Batman Forever. That's not No. It's way too comical, even for this universe, which I've heard some people say that's actually a bright spot when everybody's acting all stoic and cold and kind of sad. Yeah, if you're looking at it through that lens, I could see how you would feel that way. But the problem I have with Lex Luthor is that his motivations are horrifically confusing. And I've heard some people say that it's because he was abused by his father that he hates the idea of God, and with Superman being a god basically, a godlike being, he feels the need to prove his point that God's not good by destroying Superman. But the plot of him wanting to destroy Superman gets messy really quick, and only leads to a lot more questions than answers, which he has that guy in the wheelchair sneak into the building to blow up the Capitol. Now I think I understand the reason why for it. It's because that senator that he was talking to, played by Holly Hunter, who's alright in the scenes that she's in, but she's just kind of there. Although it is kind of funny to see that Elastigirl was in the same universe as Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman. Can you imagine that crossover if that were to happen in live action? I'd see it. But it's because she was blocking the research that he was conducting in his laboratory that he had that guy sneak in to blow up the building, so that way she couldn't stop him. On that front, okay, I was able to understand that. But if that was meant to discredit Superman, well, there was already a lot of skepticism towards Superman anyway, as far as we knew. And him showing up in Africa to stop that warlord from killing Lois Lane, that didn't help matters either. Well, Superman stopping that warlord. Which, by the way, that one tribal woman who's testifying in front of that committee, she's the main TVA agent from Loki, and she was even in Sinners last year. No joke, when she showed up, I went, oh my god! I guess the explosion at the Capitol does kind of further discredit Superman, but why is Lex Luthor creating this monster in the form of Doomsday? To defeat Superman? Well, okay, but why does he need Superman to fight Batman? To double down on discrediting Superman? Well, perhaps, yes. But if all Lex Luthor has to do is use the dead body of Zod to create this monster, mixed in with Lex Luthor's own blood to create Doomsday... Look, I know some things are best left to the audience's imagination, and I'm able to roll with some leaps in logic in movies, but this one was way too big for me to ignore, because... I don't know, maybe I'm alone on this. I think it would help if we saw a scene or two of him creating this thing. Similar to Tony Stark in the first Iron Man, where we see him building his tech, and we feel like we're going on a journey with him, and we're able to understand how he was able to create all this stuff. You could have applied a similar technique here with Lex Luthor creating Doomsday. And I know, this is a comic book inspired reality, where gods and monsters and aliens exist, but there's just certain things that if you don't take the time to explain it, some people are not going to be sold on it. As far as the supposed abuse that he experienced as a kid, I could sort of understand that reason, but it's not remotely clear in the movie from what I saw, or from what I remember. I listened very closely, and he never really once goes into it. And don't say that it was explained in the Ultimate Cut. If it's in the theatrical cut, please tell me. And really the big problem, and it ties again back to Superman, Man of Steel exists. The skepticism around Superman has already been established, and there's already enough people out there trying to discredit him. Like I said with Superman's communication problem, all he had to do was start a press conference or go on social media, make a public statement of some kind and explain what happened. Maybe most people would be alright with it if they saw how his actions carried on since then. There still would have been some questions, yes, but the skepticism would have died down significantly. And maybe Batman wouldn't have tried to kill Superman in the first place. Since I mentioned Batman, there's a few moments in here that are just really bizarre, and they don't add up to anything. There's a dream sequence that he has where it looks like Mad Max meets the DC universe. Batman is actually using a machine gun to kill people, which turns out to be soldiers for Superman. At least that's, I guess, the nightmare that he's having, where Superman's going to take over the Earth. And then Bruce wakes up and sees the Flash right in front of him, surrounded by all of this lightning, saying Lois Lane is the key, which I guess is a nod to the Flashpoint storyline involving time travel. And Bruce Wayne wakes up again, having two nightmares at once.
God damn it!
An old and tired cliche, but whatever. Trying to download some information that he was able to acquire from Diana Prince, played by Gal Gadot. Oh, yes. Okay, I know I do this quite often with certain actresses, but Wonder Woman was probably the one shining spot for me, because knowing what happens in the first Wonder Woman, I was able to have a better understanding of this. Although I think it would have benefited this movie if Wonder Woman came out before this one, but in reality, she's just kind of there. There's really not much focus given to her as to what she's been up to. She does serve a purpose in trying to manipulate Bruce Wayne, which is very similar to Catwoman and how she manipulates Bruce Wayne in Dark Knight Rises, stealing some information that he wants. And you know, I actually kind of like the Wonder Woman theme. Back when I first heard it, I wasn't that thrilled about it, but of course, that's all changed. Oh yeah, and there's something that Lex Luthor talks about where Zeus has to cast out this one god for being too rebellious or too arrogant. Clearly a reference to Ares in Greek mythology, which is who Wonder Woman goes up against in her first movie. Unless I'm getting the details wrong on that one, though. We also have a set of files that are a clear tease for the members of the Justice League to eventually turn up, where Diana looks at this file that she opens up on her computer, sent to her through an email by Bruce Wayne. We see camera footage of Barry Allen in this convenience store stopping a robbery, Cyborg being created by his father, played by Joe Morton from Terminator 2. You remember as Miles Dyson. Kind of interesting that he's working on a robot here just like he did back then. Can't help yourself, can you, pal? But then you have the introduction of Jason Momoa's Aquaman. This is still bizarre. It's like they just dumped him in a swimming pool in a backyard somewhere and got him on camera. Now, I don't know how I would have introduced him, but not like that. By this point in the movie, the script gets really, really messy and confusing. In fact, the two screenwriters, Chris Terrio and David S. Goyer, who was the main writer of Man of Steel. If you thought Man of Steel was a mess, this is that 100-fold. And Chris Terrio went on to be one of the writers for Rise of Skywalker. Yeah, not exactly a home run either, although I would rather watch that over Dawn of Justice, personally. And that's really a major issue with this movie. They cram so much stuff into one narrative that would take normally about 3 movies to build up towards this moment where we see the Justice League start to come in. Imagine if we started off in the MCU with the first Iron Man, and then a couple years later we jump right to the events of Captain America's Civil War. No context as to what happened in between those 2 points. That's basically what happens here. Now, I know you want to separate yourself from Marvel by doing something different, but building towards a certain event is what really matters. Criticize Marvel all you want, but they did all the legwork that was required to build towards Captain America's Civil War and each Avengers film that came out before and after. You had your own solo projects with not just Iron Man, but Thor, Captain America, Ant-Man, the Guardians of the Galaxy. All those plot lines would eventually come to a head as they were progressing on their own paths. You could have had a similar situation here where you start off with Man of Steel and maybe have your own Batman solo movie, have Wonder Woman come out before Dawn of Justice, and a Flash movie and an Aquaman movie. But that's the problem. You gotta set up so much stuff in one movie. It's way too much for a 2+ hour runtime. And if the Ultimate Cut makes that better somehow, please tell me. All the things that they throw in here ultimately don't lead to anything that's worthwhile, because eventually with the Justice League, that's a discussion for another day. Lois Lane being the key, which I guess that does come into fruition because she helps Batman realize Clark's humanity during the Martha scene, or she helps Superman get the spear. Even if that's true, the storytelling doesn't do a good job of conveying that, because Bruce doesn't have a moment where he remembers that dream that he had with the Flash telling him that stuff. Now, as far as the aesthetic and technical stuff, Hans Zimmer returns to compose the score along with Junkie XL. There's not really a whole lot of moments that stick out to me besides the Wonder Woman theme. I mean, naturally, I think you would want to stick with somebody like Hans Zimmer since he created a fantastic musical score with the Dark Knight trilogy. None of the music really stands out to me, and I was kind of disappointed by that. Larry Fong is the cinematographer here, and there's some moments where there's a lot of handheld, which I have to admit started to make me nauseous after a while, just like it did in Man of Steel. Though in comparison to Man of Steel, it's a lot easier to see what's going on in the action scenes. But similar to Man of Steel, the action sequences are really just loud, bombastic, and obnoxious. And the inevitable showdown that happens between Batman and Superman, this is it? This is what you guys were so excited about? After spending almost 2 hours flexing their muscles at one another, not actually having a legitimate ideological disagreement? Are you kidding me? I don't even think it was that exciting to begin with. Them just throwing each other into the walls, slamming each other's fists on one another, which, okay, yeah, that does happen in a fight like this. Sorry, but that's not enough for me. But then that leads us to the Martha moment. Yeah, it's still dumb. However, I will say that I do like the intention behind this scene, because Batman finally recognizes Superman's humanity. Superman's mom is in trouble, and Batman knows what it's like to lose both parents. But the problem I have with it is not only the dialogue, but how quickly Batman is willing to become friends with Superman. If you think I'm exaggerating or misunderstanding what the intention was, I'm not. I just explained a few minutes ago how I like the intention behind it, and I got quite a bit of pushback on Instagram. A lot of people were telling me, no, you don't understand, he recognizes his humanity. Let me make this clear to all of you guys, if you are somehow watching this. These two guys were ready to kill each other. Batman was ready to deliver the killing blow, and then Superman screams out the name Martha, which causes Bruce Wayne to freak out, remembering the name of his own mother, Martha. But then he just starts screaming, "What did you say the name?" And then Lois Lane shows up out of nowhere to tell Batman that it's Superman's mother's name. And then he goes to save Martha, who's being held hostage by that one guy who was the one S.H.I.E.L.D. agent from Captain America Winter Soldier.
It's okay. I'm a friend of your son's.
I figured.
And when he's attending Clark's funeral,
I failed him. Life. I won't fail him in death.
as if he knew this guy for many years. He was going to kill him! And just like that, they become best pals? That is not character progression. That's a character jump. If I were rewriting this scene, I would have had Superman say, "Save my mother, her name is Martha," and then have Batman stop, remembering the night his parents were killed, and have him respond with, "Wait, your mother's being held hostage? Okay, what's going on here? I'll help you out. We'll sort out our dispute later." Have them slowly let go of their grudge over time. That does not happen in a matter of seconds or minutes. Quick sidebar, I saw a post around that time where they talk about the whole "I'm with you to the end of the line" scene from The Winter Soldier, or the person who was posting that saying, "Hey, how come this gets a pass?" Here's a difference with that. Captain America, Steve Rogers, and Bucky Barnes were established as friends in the first Captain America movie. And then we see them 70 years later after Captain America joins the Avengers, and he finds out that Bucky is still alive. And we see right away that Bucky is not doing this willingly. He's being mind controlled by Hydra. And he sees the look in his eyes that makes him realize, no, this is not him doing it willingly. It's why he says on the helicarrier, "Bucky, I know you. You're my friend. Snap out of this." And as Bucky is ready to deliver the killing punch, Steve says to Bucky what Bucky said to him 70 years ago in order to remind them of their previously established friendship. And that's what finally snaps him out of it, making him realize that they're not enemies. And if there's anyone he is out there who's going to tell me, it's basically the same thing as Dawn of Justice. No, it is not. He, Batman, was going to kill him. And because both of their mothers share the same name, they become best pals. You gotta be fucking kidding me. But then that leads us to the fight against Doomsday, with Wonder Woman showing up. Which I will say, this shot of the three of them together, yeah, that is pretty badass. And with Wonder Woman right there leading the charge, okay, that's enough for me. But then it just turns into this big CGI slop. A lot of chaos and destruction going on, which is not nearly as crazy as Zod trying to destroy Metropolis, although a similar destruction kind of happens in here. Doomsday destroying the Superman statue, a big crater being formed, and Superman getting the spear with the kryptonite and using it to stab Doomsday, but then Superman gets fatally stabbed in the chest by Doomsday. As if the quick resolution of the rivalry between Superman and Batman couldn't make this any more absurd, they jump the gun even further by killing Superman. This is what you do further down the line when you've established the Justice League. Again, imagine if Marvel started off with the first Iron Man and then jumped to Civil War and then included a certain moment from Avengers Endgame. If you somehow have never seen Endgame, I won't give it away, but if you know, you know. I hate using that phrase, but it's the only way I can make that clear. You're building towards the Justice League and you kill off an important member of that team. Though they somehow, I guess, managed to figure that out, because when we close in on the coffin of Clark Kent, the dirt starts to rise up off of it, indicating that Superman eventually will return. Not just that, but the whole world worships Superman now. Just like that, everyone's okay with Superman? Those are still valid questions to have, even after his heroic sacrifice. You know, I'm actually kind of starting to run out of steam here because a lot of my energy was saved for the Martha scene, and now I just feel depleted. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I haven't even mentioned. I alluded to this earlier, but Lois Lane is really just kind of there to help the characters out, and there's really no character to her at all. Along with this one thing that Martha says to Clark when he visits her.
You don't owe this world a thing. You never did.
No, you actually do owe this world something, because the Earth took you in, and being Superman is you giving back to the world that raised you. And while Gal Gadot is certainly the best part for me, I have to admit, I did like Jeremy Irons as Alfred. If he was given more substantial material, I could see him being a solid portrayal of the character. The best scene involving Ben Affleck as the character is this exchange he has with Alfred.
He has the power to wipe out the entire human race, and if we believe there's even a 1% chance that he is our enemy, we have to take it as an absolute certainty.
It's one of the few moments where we actually get to see underneath that facade with Bruce Wayne. And there's a few moments like that throughout this movie, and I think in certain moments, Ben Affleck does get the character a lot more than the script allows him to. But even then, I think his portrayal of the character is hugely overrated, similar to Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. You know what? I don't care if I'm going to get hate for this. Both of them are massively overrated by the fans. Hugely. And the soulless vibe and dark tone doesn't necessarily bother me on principle, but it just feels way too extreme in the other direction, where a lot of people say that comic book films shouldn't be campy and fun. Now, I'm not saying that you gotta go the full Batman and Robin route. No, absolutely not. There's nothing wrong with being dark and gritty, but not every comic film has to be like that. And the same thing can be said the other way around. Chris Nolan's Batman trilogy is dark and serious, but there's a sense of excitement throughout each of those 3 films. And the characters actually act like people. They act like human beings. So really, Batman v Superman isn't an awful movie. It's just not that good. In fact, it's really just wasted potential. There's a lot of seeds of good ideas that are sprinkled throughout here, but unfortunately with all the stuff that they cram in here, from setting up the Justice League, introducing Wonder Woman, resolving the rivalry between Superman and Batman very quickly, it feels inevitably like a giant clusterfuck. Starting out somewhat promising, but then gradually takes a huge nosedive. If you like the movie, hey, more power to you. In fact, I envy anyone who does. Whether or not I check out the Ultimate Cut one day, we'll find out in time. So that's all I have for you guys on Batman v Superman. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are down below in this movie if you've seen it. And let's have a civil discussion in the comments, please. Because with this movie, if you thought the Amazing Spider-Man series was pretty divisive, don't mind the motorcycle outside my house, this one takes the cake in a lot of ways in that category. Either way, just let me know what your thoughts are down below. Hit like and subscribe if you'd like to see more from me, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one. Later!